People think working in the funeral business numbs you to death. But nothing prepares you for the day when death knocks before it's supposed to. My name is Daniel, and I've been a funeral agent for over 10 years. I've handled everything: car accidents, suicides, overdoses, even cases where the family was never found. I'm used to the silence of grief, the calm of paperwork, and the heavy certainty of death. But last fall I got a call that shattered all of that. It started with a routine order. A standard mahogany coffin. Nothing flashy. Just a name: Thomas A. Colburn, age 57. The caller said it was an advanced arrangement. Happens more often than you'd think. Some people want to choose their own coffin before they pass. Makes them feel in control, I guess. But Thomas didn't order this. And Thomas wasn't dead. In fact, he hadn't even been sick. It was mid-October. Business was steady, the air smelled like rain and dead leaves, and I had just finished a cremation meeting when my assistant, Marcy, handed me a form. New pre-need arrangement, she said. Paid in full. I glanced over the paperwork. Everything looked legitimate. Customer ID, a death certificate in process, a signature. I assumed it was handled by a hospice or hospital. I made a note to call the client's family just as a courtesy. But the number listed belonged directly to Thomas himself. I remember the conversation exactly. Hello, Mr. Colburn? Yes. This is Daniel from Rose Hill Funeral Home. I'm calling to confirm delivery details for your casket order. Boss. My what? Your casket. The mahogany with brass handles. Another pause longer. I didn't order any casket. There was a shift in his tone, something tightening. He sounded older than 57. Confused. Then he said something that made my stomach knot. I've been dreaming about a coffin. For the last 2 weeks. Exactly like the one you just described. Mahogany. Brass handles. Closed lid. No one in the dream ever opens it. Silence fell between us. I checked the paperwork again, no mistakes. Paid in cash. No return address. No family contact. Just his name. His signature. His coffin. Thomas agreed to meet me 2 days later. We chose a neutral place, a corner booth in an old diner off Route 16, where the coffee still tasted like burnt hope and the waitresses called you Han. I got there early and watched the door, wondering what kind of man dreams about his own coffin before it shows up in real life. When he walked in, I knew right away it was him. Not because of the name or the age or the cautious look he gave me across the room, but because he looked haunted. There was a tightness in his face, like he'd stopped sleeping weeks ago. His clothes hung wrong on him, a little too loose, like he hadn't been eating. The man looked like a premonition of himself. He slid into the booth and didn't speak for a long while. Just stared at the Formica table like it might offer answers. I thought it was just anxiety, he said eventually, voice low and hoarse. The dream started a month ago. Always the same, a wooden coffin heavy with those damn brass handles. It's in a room I don't recognize. Dim, still. Cold. I can't move and I can't breathe. I just know the coffin is for me. He shook his head slowly, rubbing a hand down his cheek. Then I started waking up with scratches on my arms. Like splinters. Little cuts, raw and burning. I thought maybe I'd scratched myself in my sleep. But then, he leaned closer, dropping his voice to a whisper. I started hearing the hinges creak when I was awake. I said nothing. Part of me still thought this could be a psychiatric issue: grief, guilt, suppressed trauma, but another part, the part that had worked too long in the funeral trade, remembered something else. Sometimes people came in and ordered caskets for others. Sometimes out of love. Sometimes out of something darker. Can you show me the paperwork? He asked. Maybe I'll recognize the handwriting. I agreed, and we returned to my office together. It was a gray afternoon, the sky an unbroken sheet of dull steel. The kind of day that presses down on you. We sat side by side in the filing room while I opened the drawer marked Pre-Need October. I pulled out the form and handed it to him. He stared, and his hands began to shake. That's my handwriting, he whispered. But I never wrote this. I took the paper back and studied it. The signature was a match to his ID, sure enough. But there was a stiffness to the letters, something unnatural. The loops were wrong. Too neat. Like they were copied, not felt. Then he pointed to the order line. Lid must remain sealed. He looked at me, pale as death. I never would have written that. Why the hell would I write that? I didn't have an answer. We retrieved the coffin from the storage room where it had been delivered. Still sealed in plastic. A beautiful thing, in the way coffins sometimes are, polished wood that caught the light in rich amber hues, dark brass fittings, a sheen of finality across its curves. He stared at it like it was a corpse. Then he said, "That's it. That's the one. From my dreams." I asked him if he wanted to see the inside. He hesitated. Something in him recoiled. He stepped back, mouth tightening. "No," he said. "I already know what's inside." He turned and left without another word. And that night I couldn't sleep. Not because of what he'd said, but because I started hearing the hinges creak too. The next few days passed like they were underwater. Time dragged its feet. The funeral home grew quieter than usual, as if something was holding its breath behind the walls. We had 3 regular services that week, one for a man who died in his sleep, one for a teenager who overdosed, and one for a woman whose body was never found, only declared dead after her car was pulled from a ravine with no one inside. But I couldn't stop thinking about that coffin. The one with the lid sealed. It was still sitting in the back room, the embalming supply room we never used unless we were out of space. I checked the order twice since Thomas left. The paperwork hadn't changed. Still signed. Still paid. Still branded with his name on the delivery tag, handwritten in chalk like it was headed for a morgue slab. I started locking that room at night. I didn't tell Marcy. 3 nights later, Thomas called me again. His voice was thinner now. Panicked. It came through the line like wind scraping through a keyhole. "They moved it." I didn't understand at first. They moved what? The coffin. I woke up and it was in my house. I thought he was speaking metaphorically. Another nightmare, maybe worse than the last. But he interrupted my thoughts before I could say anything. "It was in the hallway, Daniel." I woke up at 3:33 a.m. and there was this smell like wood polish and something wet. I thought maybe someone had broken in. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep under the bed and walked toward the smell. And there it was. My hallway. The same coffin. Closed. Same brass handles. I didn't imagine it. I touched it. A beat. He breathed into the phone. His voice dropped even lower. There were fingerprints on the inside of the lid. That silenced me. Not because I believed it, not entirely, but because part of me didn't want to ask if he had opened it. I already knew the answer. He hadn't. The order form said to keep the lid sealed. The next morning I drove to his house. It was a modest home on the outskirts of town, faded yellow paint, overgrown hedges, wind chimes that hadn't chimed in years. I expected to find a man unraveling from stress, from hallucinations, maybe paranoia. But the man who opened the door wasn't broken. He was angry. He led me inside without a word, pointing down a narrow hallway. The carpet had been recently scrubbed, still damp in places. The smell of bleach mixed with something sour lingered in the air. "There," he said. It was right there, blocking the hallway. I looked. Nothing. But he wasn't finished. He led me to his bedroom, disheveled, curtains closed, a few empty bottles of sleeping pills on the dresser, and pulled a digital camera from the nightstand drawer. "I took a picture," he said. My hands were shaking, but I pressed the button. It was real. "You have to see it." He handed me the camera and I clicked through. Most of the images were dark, poorly lit, nothing but shadows and streaks. But one of them made my skin tighten. A box. Wooden. Gleaming. The brass catching a dim flash. It sat in his hallway like it had always belonged there. But what made the picture so unbearable, what made my hands start to tremble slightly, was what I saw in the corner of the frame. A shape. Tall. Thin. Standing just beyond the coffin's edge, half blurred, as if in motion. It wasn't Thomas. And it wasn't me. He looked at me, eyes sunken, mouth a thin line. "I didn't see it until later," he said. "Whatever that is, it's not just in the dreams anymore." That night I returned to the funeral home. The building felt different now, colder. Like the air had settled wrong. I unlocked the back room where the coffin sat. It still rested there, undisturbed, wrapped in its protective sheet. But something had changed. The plastic was torn. Only slightly. A gash along the side, as if it had been snagged or cut. I stood there, alone under the humming fluorescent light, staring at the thing that had started all this. I could hear my own breath echoing in the room. I stepped forward. My hand hovered over the brass handle. Something in me whispered no, not in words, but in bone-deep instinct. But I needed to know. I peeled back the rest of the plastic. The coffin gleamed under the light. It looked too new. Like it had never belonged to any world with dirt and graves. I gripped the handle and heard something. A soft shifting inside. Like cloth moving. Or skin. I dropped the lid before I could lift it, stepped back, heart hammering in my ears. The sound stopped. The silence came rushing back. I waited, not breathing. But there was nothing more. I locked the room again. This time I kept the key in my pocket. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. I stopped sleeping. Nights became longer than they had any right to be, and the funeral home felt like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. I stopped turning off the hallway lights, stopped walking past the embalming room after hours. I even stopped locking the door to my office as if being locked out might be worse than being locked in. I kept checking on the coffin. It hadn't moved. Not exactly. But I could never shake the sense that it was aware. Its placement would change subtly. One day it sat 6 inches to the left. Another day it was turned slightly toward the door. Once I found the room colder than the rest of the building, so cold, my breath came out in fog. That made no sense. There were no vents in that storage room. No windows. No reason for anything in there to breathe. And still the note echoed in my head. Lid must remain sealed. I started leaving a small wooden crucifix on the lid, not because I'm particularly religious. I'm not, but because some ancient part of me needed a symbol of barrier. A line. An anchor. It didn't help. Thomas stopped calling. At first, I assumed he was exhausted, or perhaps trying to distance himself from the ordeal, maybe even leave town. But after a week of silence, I drove back to his house. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. His mailbox overflowed. Newspapers stacked on the porch. The curtains were still drawn, and the wind had pushed leaves against the door like nature was trying to seal it off. I knocked. No answer. I rang. Nothing. And then I tried the handle. The door wasn't locked. The smell inside hit me first: stale sweat, mold, something sharp underneath. I called out to him, but the house answered only in silence. I moved room to room, slow and cautious, the floorboards creaking beneath my shoes like they didn't want me there. His bedroom was exactly how I'd left it weeks earlier, except the bed hadn't been slept in. The sheets were pulled tight, untouched. The lamp still unplugged. But on the wall beside the dresser, someone Thomas, I assumed, had begun drawing something in charcoal. A rectangle. Over and over. Overlapping, darkened in places, growing larger and more aggressive. Hundreds of them. Some were sealed with a thick line across the top. Some were open. Some had eyes drawn inside them. And beneath the largest one, at the center of the wall, he had scrawled a single sentence in a frantic, jagged hand. "It wants me to lie down." That was when I called the police. They found Thomas later that evening. He hadn't left town. He hadn't vanished. He was in room 613 at St. Bridget's Psychiatric Center, placed under a temporary 72-hour hold after being found disoriented in the middle of a gas station parking lot, barefoot and muttering something about wooden teeth and nails in the dark. I visited him the next morning after explaining to the nurse that I was a friend, a lie, but not entirely untrue. They let me in for 10 minutes. What I saw made my mouth go dry. Thomas was thinner, sharper, as though his skin had given up holding him together. His arms were wrapped in gauze. His eyes darted constantly, not in fear, but as if watching something that moved in places no one else could see. He didn't speak right away. He just stared at me until I sat down. Then he whispered. It climbed in. I didn't understand. He looked past me toward the corner of the room. Something's inside the box now. Not me, not yet, but something else. Waiting. I see it in the cracks of my dreams. It watches me from the other side. Smiling. I leaned forward. Thomas, the coffin is still at the funeral home. Nothing's moved. I swear. He looked at me like I was a child trying to describe the sky to a blind man. No, he said quietly. It's not there anymore. Not really. You think it is. But it's here. Inside. I feel the lid every time I close my eyes. He paused. I don't dream anymore, Daniel. I just hear dirt. Falling. I left that day feeling sick. As I drove home, the trees seemed darker than they should have been. The sun felt dim. I caught myself checking the back seat 3 times before I pulled into the driveway. That night, I went back to the funeral home one final time. It was almost midnight. The building sat still and hulking against the moonless sky, its windows blank and dim. I walked through the front, passing the reception desk and arrangement room, until I reached the back hallway. I could feel it before I saw it. The cold. The absence. I unlocked the embalming supply room. And stopped. The coffin was still there. Center of the room. Still in place. The crucifix I'd placed on top was missing. But now there were handprints on the lid. Not dusty. Pressed. From the inside. I turned and backed out slowly, not daring to blink. I locked the door. Not because I thought it would keep something in, but because I didn't want to see what might already be out. The days blurred. I returned to work each morning as if nothing had happened, going through the motions with a hollow kind of precision. I smiled at grieving families. I shook hands with quiet men in suits. I arranged lilies and urns and filled out forms for the recently departed, all while the room at the end of the hall remained locked. But the smell had started to spread. It was subtle at first. A trace of something like rotting pine or waterlogged earth. I replaced the air filters. I sprayed the vents. I told myself it was mildew in the walls. Until clients started to notice. One woman stopped in the middle of a preneed arrangement and sniffed the air. "It smells like wet wood," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Like something buried too long." I didn't answer. I just handed her a pen to sign the contract. I began dreaming of the coffin. Not in a metaphorical way. Not an anxiety dream, not symbolic. No, I saw it as clearly as I saw the sun each morning, sitting alone in the center of the supply room, surrounded by shadows that moved without form. The dreams were always the same. I'd stand over the coffin, heart pounding, and reach forward to open it even though I didn't want to, even though every cell in my body screamed no. And just before my fingers touched the lid, I would wake up. Every night. Same moment. Except once. That night, in the dream, the lid opened on its own. There was no sound. Just a slow creaking like breath through old floorboards. The room inside the dream didn't look like the funeral home anymore. It looked older, wetter, with cracked tile and pale green walls that wept moisture. And when the lid lifted fully, there was nothing inside. Just a cavity. Endless. Blacker than sleep. Until something blinked. 2 eyes. Human, but ruined, milky and cracked like mirrors struck by stones. They stared up at me. And then a hand rose, fleshless and silent, and pointed to the space beside it. Wanted me to get in. I woke in my bed, drenched in cold sweat. The air was thick, heavy, my pillow damp, and my hands, both of them, were smeared with something dark. I turned on the light. It was soil. Black earth. Packed beneath my fingernails. On my palms. Across my forearms like I'd been digging something with both fists. That was the moment I knew. This thing, whatever it was, had claimed me. I returned to the funeral home just after 4 a.m. The building was quiet. Empty. The world outside was still gray with the half-light that comes before dawn. I didn't bring anything with me, no flashlight, no tools, no prayers. I didn't knock on the office door or flick on the front lights. I walked through the halls like someone being led to their own sentencing. The key to the supply room felt hot in my hand. I unlocked the door. The coffin sat where I had left it, but the plastic was gone now. The lid was open, propped gently like someone had just stepped away. No markings on the outside. No hinges creaking. Just that same impossible presence. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I don't know how long. And then I stepped inside. The room felt deeper now, like the walls had stretched back into darkness. I took one step, then another. The lights above flickered as I neared the coffin. Not violently, not horror movie sparks, just a soft stutter, like an old man clearing his throat. And then I looked inside. It wasn't empty. There was a man lying in the coffin. Well, perfectly still. Dressed in a black suit, the same brand we sold in the showroom. His face was gaunt. His hands folded over his chest. But what made my legs go numb was the fact that the man in the coffin was me. Not similar. Not a trick of the light. Me. Same cheek scar. Same wristwatch. Same slight crook in the nose from when I broke it in high school. And just as I stepped back in horror, the corpse's eyes opened. They didn't blink. They just stared. Calm. Familiar. Like someone watching you in a mirror from the other side of the glass. Then his lips moved. Barely. "Thank you," he said. I was tired of standing. The lid began to close. I don't remember driving home. Or sleeping. But the next morning, the coffin was gone. The room was clean. No scent. No fingerprints. Just an empty floor and a faint outline in the dust, as if something heavy had once rested there and had finally been claimed. I called St. Bridget's. They told me Thomas had died in his sleep the night before. Heart failure. No pain. He never even stirred. They found him with his hands folded over his chest. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. That it wasn't real. That grief makes ghosts. That funerals leave residue in the mind, like soot in a chimney. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know what I felt. Because now, every night before sleep, I hear it. The sound of a coffin lid creaking open. And each time it opens just a little wider. Waiting. I started sleeping with the lights on. It didn't help. The shadows just shifted, learned to mimic the angles of the room. I began to notice things in mirrors that weren't in the room with me. Not people, not quite, but outlines. Smudges. The impression of someone watching me from a distance too close to measure. One night, I woke to find the bedroom window open. I hadn't touched it in months. There was no wind, no movement. But on the floor, right beneath the sill, was a small mound of soil. Damp. Black. With something long and pale sticking out of it, A tooth. Human. Perfectly intact. I buried it in the trash. Washed my hands 3 times. But the next morning it was back. On my nightstand. Sitting like a promise. That day I quit the funeral business. I told the owner I'd had enough. No more embalming. No more quiet music and stitched mouths and men in ties offering sympathy like candy. I packed my things, turned in my key and walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. But deep down I knew it was too late. You don't come back from seeing your own corpse. You don't get to go on like it didn't look at you. Now, every so often, when the hour slips past midnight and the house holds its breath, I hear a sound coming from just beneath the floorboards. Not scratching. Not creaking. Breathing. Soft. Patient. Like someone lying in a box with the lid slightly cracked, waiting for me to lie down and listen. And sometimes when I can't help myself, I do. Just for a moment. I press my ear to the floor. And I swear I hear my own voice whisper back. It's warmer down here. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story.